Today we're going to talk about pre-ground coffee. It's going to get a little bit controversial because we want to wrestle with the idea that fresh is always best. Because that's what we tell people. We always say grind your coffee fresh. You should have a nice coffee grinder at home. Grinding coffee fresh is a delight. It's an amazing way to start your day, aromatically speaking, and from a flavour perspective. But what if it isn't always true? Here's a little thought experiment for you. Take a really nice grinder. Grind the coffee fresh. Compare that to cheaper grinders. It'll definitely be better than the cheaper grinders because it's a fancy grinder. It's what it does. But what about that coffee one day later? Is it still better than fresh coffee from a cheaper grinder? What about 2? What about 5? What about 10? What about 20? At what point does coffee from a fancy grinder get worse from age than fresh coffee from a cheaper grinder? Now, this experiment has been done. It was done by Prima Coffee. I'll leave a link to the article they published down in the description below. They said that if you took coffee from an EK43, it wasn't until that coffee was 5 days old that it was worse than fresh coffee from something like a Baratza Encore. And actually in their testing, it was always significantly better than the sort of cheaper grinders that they used. It's a big claim. It's an interesting claim. And it's relevant to those of us that might buy a bag of pre-ground coffee from a local coffee shop. You might say, oh yeah, grind it for filter for me, grind it for a mocha pot, grind it for a French press. You might buy your coffee pre-ground online. If you're buying it every week, is that better than just using a cheap grinder at home? To try and answer this question more fully, we're going to do a few different tastings. The first 2 are going to be me doing a tasting, and I'll explain what's happening in the tasting. The third one is interesting though. We went out and did a tasting with the general public, with normal people. Do they agree with me? Anyway, let's talk about this first experiment. What we'll do first of all is take some coffee, same coffee, ground at different ages. So same bag of coffee, ground just now, 1 day old, 2 day old, 7 day old, 8 day old, 9, 10, 11, skipped a couple of days because of a weekend, 14, 15, 16. Would have liked a little bit more up here, but logistics said no. So we'll taste it through, and I'll tell you, because this is just interesting, where I feel there's significant loss of quality. But then what we'll do is we've got a bowl ground fresh from 3 different grinders. We've got a cheap whirly blade grinder. We've got a cheap false burr grinder, and we've got a Baratza ESP as a cheap, good burr grinder. What I'll do is I'll then taste those and place them at the point at which they are better than the pre-ground. Because this is all coming from a low uniformity burr, fancy grinder. This is very nicely ground. Very few people have done this test. They have opinions about freshly ground coffee, but they haven't done this test. So, fresh. Yummy, tasty, sweet, very enjoyable, complex. A day old, 24 mere hours. Oh, there is like less there. It's not actively unpleasant, but a bunch is missing. The sweetness has fallen off a little bit. It's lost some of the kind of aromatic complexity. What about 2 days old? 48 hours. Even more is kind of missing. I wouldn't say there's a ton of negative flavour yet. It's starting to creep in, but we've definitely lost a lot of positive flavour. I'm surprised at how rapidly it falls off. By the time you get to 7 days, not a lot going on at all. If I go back to this one, it's alive, it's vibrant, it's got some fruit, it's sweet, it's got a little bit of those kind of caramels in there. It's tasty. So we'll go through 8. 10 days old. And really the beginnings of now some unpleasant flavours creeping in. It's not a particularly interesting coffee at this point. It doesn't feel special. It certainly doesn't feel worth the premium that it would carry as specialty coffee, right? Like it's going to have a cost attached to its quality. You've lost a bunch of its quality there, which is a shame because it's going to cost you the same as a bag of the whole bean. That's all I'm saying. Ugh. All right, there's some real kind of bite to this now. Almost a little bit roastier, actually. It tastes just harsher. The finish is definitely more bitter. So let's find a grinder. Let's pick our whirly blade grinder. Here you go. Labeled for your convenience, blade grinder. How does this taste? This is a tricky one. There's some aromatic complexity in that, but it is bitter and astringent at the same time as well. Which would I rather drink? I'd rather drink, honestly, I'd rather drink this than that. Like, for all its complexity, it's just less enjoyable. Let's jump down here. I'm going to put the blade about here. I'd rather drink the blade than this, just, it's kind of on a level footing of enjoyment for me. And so if I owned a blade grinder, you could argue I'd be better buying pre-ground from a fancier grinder, as long as I could drink it within this window of maybe 7 days. Is that contentious? I don't know. Let's grab our false burr grinder. Let's have a little taste. That's worse. Is that worse than the blade? Kind of worse than the blade. Oh, let's move you down here, because where do we have to get to? That is worse. Okay. I think we're going to end up here. Yeah. The false burr grinder is marginally worse than the blade, which is genuinely surprising to me. Or is it? I just don't like those false burr grinders. All right, let's get a good grinder. The Baratza ESP is a conical burr grinder, but I think it's a good grinder. £160, not cheap, but relatively inexpensive compared to fancier burr grinders. All right. Okay. We're definitely going up this way. Yeah, I think I've placed it right. I think it is not quite as good as the fancy grinder, but it's better for me than one-day-old coffee because it's got a ton of complexity. It's not quite as sweet, but really it's still very nice. I think that is nearly as good as fresh because it's still fresh. But these two, yeah, I would rather drink the fancier grinder that's older than fresh from those, which is conflicting as a message. Now, some of you would say, perhaps correctly, you recommend storing beans in the freezer. And I do. I think storing beans long-term in the freezer is a good idea. Well then, what if you did the same test, but you froze the ground coffee? What if I was keeping my ground coffee in the freezer? That's a great question. I want to know the answer too. So we're basically repeating the test, except after each coffee was ground, with the exception of this one here, it was put into a little bag, into the freezer, kept at minus 20 degrees Celsius for however many days it was, be it 1 to 16 again. I'm kind of curious if this is going to imply that if you have to buy a pre-ground coffee and someone grinds it for you fresh in the cafe, should you take it home and put that in the freezer? What happens when you go from fresh, tasty, sweet, complex, to one day old? There is still some loss of complexity. Maybe less. Maybe less. I'm curious how 7 days tastes. Okay, that harshness has begun to turn up. Ooh, that's not good. Yeah, these are all pretty bad, actually, down this end. All right. Yeah, let's get the blade grinder out and see where we're at. So last time the blade grinder was roughly around here. Let's see how it's tasting. Just pretty inoffensive. I mean, not great, not like this, but I think it's actually here. Might have moved off a spot, might not, but it's in this ballpark. Let's check the old false burr. I'm not being negative, I'm just trying to give it some space, you know. Okay. It's confusing, because last time these were the other way around, but I can't lie to you, this is how I feel. Am I a highly replicable machine of tasting? Absolutely not. No, not even slightly. I'm a sloppy human meat bag, and I'm not that good at this, but that's just my feeling. Let's get the old Baratza out. Now this time, this did pretty well. Yeah, it's still up there. Now that's an interesting test today. What I sort of thought would happen in theory is that these should have slid even further down, because I kind of argued that these were better to some extent than the others, but I don't think it's a particularly big difference. Plus, this is one bowl. You've got to understand this is coffee's problem, right? Like there's a lot of variables, especially with grinders like this that produce very uneven distributions of grind. Did we just do a slightly worse job running the blade grinder for exactly the right amount of time last time? Or was the false blade grinder having a slightly better day? Either way, yeah, it still stands that I would rather drink week-old coffee 7-day-old coffee from a really good grinder than from a cheaper grinder. That sort of perhaps reinforces or replicates some of what Prima's experiments did. And I was a little skeptical of it, but no, having tasted it, I would really rather, in both cases, drink 7-day-old, pre-ground, from a good grinder than these. Okay, so before we get to the next stage, that final tasting with the general public, which is really interesting, it's going to raise questions around tasting and one's ability to taste and developing, I suppose, your own palate. And that's where the sponsor of this video kind of comes in, and I'll tell you about it and how it all works in this short ad. Cometeer and I have collaborated and we have created this. It's the Discovery Box. Now, if you did the Great American Taste Test last year, or if you saw that last year, you may be a little bit familiar with this. This is a little bit like that, but more evolved. Inside this box are 8 different coffees. Each of them has been perfectly brewed, flash frozen, essentially something stronger than an espresso inside each capsule. And because they're flash frozen after brewing and you keep them frozen in your freezer, well, unlike ground coffee, Cometeer capsules taste good for an incredibly long time. All you have to do to drink the coffee is just melt it into some hot water, or melt it and add it to some cold water if you like iced coffee, or to some milk. Anyway, we're getting off topic. The idea with the Discovery Box is a little bit different to the Great American Taste Test. Here, I've chosen 8 different coffees that I think provide a really fun journey through the broad, sort of diverse array of flavors that coffee has to offer. Each day, you drink a coffee, and there's a video from me telling you a little bit more about it, a bit about what you're tasting and why it tastes the way that it does. Day by day, you can build up a profile of your own preferences, an understanding of your own preferences, why you like the coffee you like, why you love the coffee you love, and actually which coffees in the future you may wish to avoid. It's a really fun, really easy little journey, and it's a great treat for yourself, but it's also a tremendous gift to give to someone that you want to drag down the rabbit hole into the world of delicious coffee. Only available in the US. If you want to pick one up, there is a link in the description down below. I hope you join in. I hope you have some fun. I hope you share your results and have a really fun journey through coffee with me and with Cometeer. Thank you to them for sponsoring this video. Let's talk through the consumer tasting that we did. We borrowed the customers of Proof Rock in London. So we went by, we took over the basement and brewed 4 different cups of coffee for people to try. It was the week-old coffee from the EG1 compared to fresh coffee from the 3 grinders. It was all brewed as pour-overs, as a V60, as 2-cup V60, and we would then break that down into small samples on little trays to give to people. And what we asked them, this might be controversial, we just said rank them. Rank your preference from the one you like the most down to the one you like the least. So, assign each one a number from 1 to 4. So when we come to look at some numbers, and I'll remind you later, lower is better because it's closer to number 1, the most preferred of the coffees. We did this for, I think, just under 90 people in total, including a handful of the staff who work at Proof Rock too, because it was just interesting to get a broad range of tasters out there. And so, here's the question. Did people agree with the tasting? What I think should have happened, based on my tasting, is that they should probably like the Baratza the most, then they should like the pre-ground coffee second, and then they should sort of dislike the 2 cheaper grinders out there. That, theoretically, should be the order of things, because the coffee was 7 days old, and I thought the fresh Baratza was significantly better than that. Did they agree? Aside from ranking, we asked them also what they typically drink coffee-wise. Are they a espresso-based coffee drinker? Are they a filter coffee drinker? Or would they say they were both? This had come out of doing an earlier test with a smaller number of people where we'd learned some things and wanted to ask just one more question to understand a bit about their preferences. So the results, kind of good, kind of bad. Technically speaking, if we look at the table here, what we've got is the sort of average score for each of the grinders across everybody here. So you see stale, blade, false Baratza, kind of going down. The lower the number, the better. And so what you see is the Baratza indeed has the lowest number. Just. Followed by the stale coffee. Just. Followed by the blade and false. And here the false burrs came sort of a good bit last. Great. Point proved, right? Well, no. Not really. Like, this is technically true, but if you do the stats on this, your kind of confidence that this isn't just random is very low. Basically, you could argue that they were indistinguishable to people, right? There was no real strong, coherent opinion in this group. And that's kind of frustrating because you want to just say everyone likes the fresh. Everyone likes the good grinder fresh. That's nice and easy. But it didn't always score that way. What I will say is interesting. These are just obviously averages. If you look at the mode data for these, the mode being the most common response in the data, both the stale and the Baratza, the mode response was 1, preference. So it got a lot more preferreds than anything else. And the mode for the blade and the false were lower ranked. So you feel like you could look at the data and say, I am supported in that. But not really well, which is frustrating. Now, interestingly, we broke them out into those categories, right? We said, what about people who just drink espresso-based drinks? Are their preferences different to filter coffee drinkers? And actually, kinda. Again, in the espresso group, the preferences shift around a little bit. Bizarrely, they preferred the blade grinder, which is, I don't know, not by much. Again, there's a pretty low confidence value here. But if you look at the filter coffee, well, this is more interesting because that's kind of your target market here. These are people who drink filter coffee, have built a preference around filter coffee. Where do they sit? And here, they strongly preferred the Baratza. That did really well in the filter selection of people. And the blade grinder did pretty terribly. Interestingly, the false and the stale, though, amongst the sort of filter coffee drinkers, pretty indistinguishable, which is kind of surprising to me, but I don't know anymore if it is surprising to me. And so there was a small subset that said they drank both. Their data was entirely too small to have any real sort of mineable use to us here. So we can just say there's nothing statistically significant here. So at best, in the subset of filter coffee drinkers, they prefer the fresh ground good grinder, which I think is good news. But really the data is not conclusive. Now, you could argue we've asked a bad question, and I would possibly agree with you there. We said just rank these from 1 to 4. We didn't give a framework of what you should rank. We didn't say which one has the nicest flavor. We didn't say which one has the nicest texture or body or mouthfeel, which one is the most or least bitter. We didn't really give a tasting framework to assess how these coffees are different. And I would argue, perhaps with a massive bias, that if we'd done that, I think we'd have seen much more pronounced results, and probably more pronounced results in line with what we would have expected. If I'd said rank them by bitterness and then rank them by complexity of flavor and then by sort of mouthfeel and then combine those scores to decide which ones you think are the best and the worst and then rank them overall, I think we'd have had different results. And that's just the nature of learning to taste. If you just say which one do you like the best, that's almost a little bit emotional as much as it's a sort of assessment of the cold, hard flavors, for want of a better term. But I don't want to dwell on our failings here, because that's not a useful thing for you, the viewer. What do you take away from this whole experiment? It's a good question. The obvious thing to take away is that if you use a bag of coffee in a week and you don't want to buy a grinder, maybe you don't have to. That would be the obvious thing. I just don't know if that's true. While I still stand by what I said, which is I would have rather drunk the pre-ground 7-day-old than the fresh from the 2 cheap grinders, that was also pre-ground coffee dialed in properly for the 1 brew method and the 1 recipe that we were using. Having a coffee grinder isn't just about freshness. It is also about control and manipulating your grind size to match the brew method that you're using. And so, yeah, maybe if you have exactly the same brew method, maybe if you're like an infusion brewer, like an AeroPress or a French press where the grind size isn't as much of a kind of knife edge thing, as big a decider of overall extraction as it is in something like a pour over, maybe you could argue that yes, if you just don't have the budget for a £160 grinder, once a week buying really great coffee, ground appropriately, keeping it sealed whenever you can, may result in a better week of coffee than getting a cheap grinder. Which I don't like that. Or do I? I don't know how I feel about it. I feel conflicted about it in a way that I struggle to explain. It's always fun when you get something that is an exception to the rule, like which is always grind fresh, except when you shouldn't. And it's nice to find a limited case of when you shouldn't. I think it's one where that Prima blog post has been passed around again and again and again. It's referenced often. And it was one where I'm very glad to have gone and tested it. And while our results don't exactly overlap with theirs, I think the basic premise kind of does, which is interesting. So I think that's kind of cool. I'm curious if you read that post and if you ever tried anything similar. Have you ever done a sort of day-by-day tasting of what happens to coffee as it ages. It's not hard to do, and I would recommend you try it if you want to. Just every day, grind 15 grams of coffee and keep it. And at the end of a week, get those 7 cups and brew them side by side and just watch the flavour disappear over time. It's genuinely very interesting. If you do that, let me know your results down in the comments below. And if you've got any other ideas or thoughts on this whole thing, I would love to hear them. But for now, I'll say thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great day.